Before you dive in, where are you reading this from tonight? Tell me in the comments below. Now let's get into the story. A soldier with one child is cast out in the late afternoon rain. Days later, a hidden drawing forces those who cast them out to bow their heads and earns the respect of the neighborhood. The town that had been home to James Harlow looked the same through the taxi window and not the same at all. The row of maples along the main street wore their early autumn leaves like flags half-moored. The hardware store still had the same rusted sign. The coffee shop on the corner still played a low jazz record the way it had 8 years before. But the block James had grown up on, where he had taken his first steps on a porch that smelled of lemon oil and where his late wife had once laughed so loud the neighbors pressed their faces to the fence, appeared to shrink behind glass, or perhaps he had grown taller and the neighborhood smaller. It was a private narrowing, an inside caving he had not expected. He felt it in his chest first. A small, cold vacancy where a familiar shape should have been. The house held its breath when James stepped up the path. It looked tidy in a way that hurt. Curtains starched and straight, the lawn cut in clean geometry, the stoop swept of every stray leaf. It read like a photograph of being proper. The front door opened before he knocked. The woman who stood in the doorway had practiced a smile into hardness and painted it into place as if it were a shield. Her hair was pulled back and precise. She wore a cardigan that did not wrinkle and a ring that flashed in the dour light. In her heels she might have been an actress hired to play domestic serenity. "James," she said, and the name was a test she had decided to pass. "You're on time." He had been out of uniform a long time and in different uniforms again and again during deployments that had a way of stealing days and returning them like gifts wrapped in paper thin with distance. Now he carried a duffel with his remaining belongings and a body that had learned to divide itself neatly. Duty here, grief there, waiting for his answer somewhere in the middle. He had come because a letter and a dozen small couriered messages had told him his child, Lucas, was not thriving under the long silent care of the woman he had trusted with the name Aunt when he had to go away. He had come because his son's voice, when he had heard those odd, choked phone calls from a neighbor, could not be ignored. He had come because he had been a soldier who failed once and vowed never to again. The woman, Claire Penn, stepped aside and let him in with a precision befitting someone who judged everything by the degree to which it could be explained. Her house smelled like citrus cleaner and a faint trace of something floral that might have been perfume or might have been the sanitizing fog of carefully arranged life. The living room stood on ceremony. Couch cushions plumped at right angles, children's books arranged by color on the lower shelf, a small armchair with a crocheted blanket folded perfectly on its back. Even the toys seemed content to be toys, placed in an order that suggested no rough handling. On a coffee table lay a plate with 3 ginger cookies, untouched but not stale. He took in these things the way a man accustomed to surveillance took in terrain. He noticed the slight marks on the arm of the couch where a child had dragged a thumb in a habit of counting or comforting. He noticed the faint scuff at the baseboard beneath the window, a chip in the paint like a small tooth-shaped wound. He saw a child's small shoe tucked under the leg of the table, its laces tied not in a hurried knot but in neat double bows. They were the kind of evidence that made a man look twice. "Lucas is in his room," Claire said. He's quiet today. You'll do fine. You're home now." The voice had the careful warmth of a newscaster reading a condolence. James took his bag and followed the sound of footsteps that retraced their way to a hall. The hallway smelled of crayons and lemon-scented air freshener. On the wall, a photograph. James, his wife, Anna, smiling beside him 3 days before the deployment that had taken them to the other side of the world. Anna's smile in the picture was a soft, pulling thing that made James's throat ache with its absence. He remembered her the way some men remember a name. Exact, painful, abiding. Lucas's door was ajar. A nursery print mobile turned slowly in a draft he couldn't feel. The boy sat on the floor with his back to the doorway, knees drawn up, a threadbare dinosaur between them like a talisman. He was small for his 6 years, hair cut short in a practical way. His ears stuck a little, as if he had always been listening. The first thing James noticed was not any mark on Lucas's body. It was the posture. The child's shoulders were drawn in as if braced against a wind he could not see. "Hey!" James said softly. The boy looked up. For a moment he did not recognize the man who carried his name. Then his face shifted as if grasping a shape he had been waiting to name. His eyes were two dark wells rimmed by faint shadows. He did not run to James. He did not leap into his arms. He simply allowed James's hand to hover for a long beat, and then he placed his small palm into James's. A thin, fragile handshake. "Hi, Daddy," he said in a voice so small James feared it might be the sound of a toy manufacturer's sample. The words arrived like an offering balanced on a bitter tray. James's relief came cold. He wanted to pick Lucas up, to feel the smallness of him, to smell hair and breath and the warm salt of a child's skin. But the boy flinched. His gaze darted toward the doorway as if someone else might appear at any second, assessing the terrain for danger. He clenched the threadbare dinosaur with both fists, as if it were the only anchor that still remained. "Where's your jacket?" Claire said before he could ask. Her voice was brisk, polished, an answer pre-made. "It gets chilly. We were about to read a story." "Lucas, dear, go put on your jacket." Lucas stayed where he was. His mouth moved like a small animal smelling the air for instructions. His bare arms showed a faded crescent bruise near the elbow. Too light to be reckoned a wound in a polite household's report, but present enough to hush a father into attention. It was the sort of mark that could have been a scrape off the bike. Claire followed his glance to the mark and rounded it off with a story about a fall. "It was just with a neighbor's kid," she said. "He runs too fast sometimes. I told him about not taking too much risk." "You told him?" James repeated. The phrase hit like a small stone. His past training made his tone even. Something in him measured every syllable. Skepticism sat at the base of his throat like a living thing. He had missed birthdays and bedtimes in years. Absence was a strange teacher, but it had sharpened a man into a skill set of noticing. He noticed how Claire's knee made a slight movement when she spoke. How, despite the steady veneer, there was a quickness under the control, a flicker. "Of course," she said. "I look after him. He needs structure." That word, structure, hung there, the reason every controlling hand used to baptize its work. James felt something old and raw press along his ribs. The memory of a time when he could not protect. A time when he had believed orders were the shield and they'd turned out to be paper. He swallowed the sharpness and answered calmly. "Can I take him to the park?" "For a bit." Claire's smile was the practiced hinge of someone who kept a ledger of social ease. "He's fine. He doesn't need more running around. He's been a little unsettled." "Unsettled how?" James asked. She looked at Lucas instead of at him. The boy had resumed an almost mechanical playing with a game. His fingers traced the same vein on the dinosaur's neck in a repeated, small rhythm. Claire's voice softened into something designed for other people's ears. "He misses you, I think," she said. "He has some trouble with, well, change. But it's manageable." James stepped closer to Lucas. He crouched down until his face was level with the child's. He wanted to ask the questions that would split apology and guilt open, but he had trained himself to listen more than to speak. "Tell me what happened today," he said as gently as the spring wind. Lucas's gaze flicked to him and then away, as if answering required a passport. He ran a thumb over the inner curve of his wrist, a habit, perhaps. He looked at the floor, at the corner of a drawing that poked from beneath the arm of the chair, an unfinished constellation of angry blue strokes, and then his mouth moved in a fragile, secret set. "My mom's in there," he said in a whisper that trembled like a thread. "She's in there." The words were small as a match and as flammable. James felt them land and bloom in his chest, not with heat but with an ice-cleaving clarity. His brain did what it had been trained for in other theaters of violence. Evaluate, triangulate, plan. A child's phrase like that was not simply a report. It was an indicator. A child's insistence that "my mom's in there" meant a place, a fear, an object. It implied an adult behind closed doors. It implied a locked thing. The context made it a threshold between ordinary and extraordinary danger. "Who?" Claire asked, with the careful alarm of someone staging their own part. "Who is in there, Lucas?" "My mom," the boy repeated. "She's in there." Claire widened her eyes toward him as if to show sympathy, and then at James with an expression that begged him to acknowledge the polite explanation she would give. "He has his mother in his head a lot," she said to James casually, like a doctor pronouncing an inconvenient diagnosis. Sometimes he imagines her. It's grief and all. He talks about her like she's physically present. The phrase, the lie, fitted like a seam into the fabric of the room. James felt the thread pull. He had seen that lie before across the table of truth and time. "It's grief," said the caretakers, the institutions, the people who had more to lose by scrutiny than by truth. He had been away when Anna's illness took shape, when the doctors had folded their hands and a world had narrowed to small rituals. Guilt had become an instrument along with his uniform, and he had learned to cipher it into action. "Has he said anything else?" James asked, and he kept his voice level so it would be easy to believe that he asked for curiosity and not confrontation. Claire's hand fluttered to the cookies on the table, as if to claim them as a small civil defense. "Sometimes he draws," she said. "Children make things up. He draws houses and says they're closed. It should pass. He'll adjust." Lucas's fingers tightened on the dinosaur as if afraid the creature might prove unreliable. He said nothing more, but he drew all the same. In the living room at a small table lay a page of his recent work, a house sketched with blunt certainty. In the small square window of that house, where a warm family would usually sit, a blue shape had filled the room. Spirals that crowded into a corner, a small dark figure shone in the throat of a house. The child had labeled the figure with tiny, careful letters. The house door had a key stuck in it, drawn with heavy hesitation. The drawing shifted the atmosphere in the room. It was the kind of artifact that did not speak as adults do. It whispered with the eloquence of a small body trying to map terror with crayon. Claire's smile did not quite meet her eyes. James put the drawing into his pocket like a bullet. He did not say the thing that unspooled inside him, about a mother's presence behind doors, about the plausibility of physical harm, but he had to check what else was being kept in cupboards of explanation. He had to find the door to the in there. Over the next week James moved like a man on underwater patrol, aware of every small current and sound. He slept poorly, one eye open to walls and memories. He watched Claire with the patience of a man waiting for light to fall into cracks. She was careful around him, always, as if she had a sense of being inspected. She arranged playdates with neighbors that were public and scheduled. She kept the house immaculate. She took Lucas to soccer practice and to piano lessons. She spoke of school and of progress with a tone that had been rehearsed. But children leave traces. They leave sleep patterns and soiled socks and secret drawings. They leave crumbs in a corner. They leave anxiety in a gate. The small bruise on Lucas's arm darkened and faded in a cycle that suggested more than one fall. Sometimes Lucas would hold his forearm and speak little circles of nonsense, phrases like beads sliding on a thread. He would hum melodies that were not songs but were patterned like teeth marks. At night he would wake and sit in the doorway and do nothing but watch the wall where shadows gathered. When James put a hand on his back to soothe him he would stiffen, then relax enough to allow the comfort. James began to test Claire, in small ways that didn't require accusation. He would ask about the neighbor kids, about the school's progress, about Lucas's nurse. She answered with the same steady cadence. "He's fine," she said, or "he's adjusting," or "he's been anxious since his mother." And then she would correct herself, "Keep it neat." He began to ask others for small confirmations. From the teacher came an account of a child who had grown oddly still. From the elderly woman across the hall, Mrs. Fenn, came a softer confession. "It was nothing really," she'd said, "but I saw the boy once, running home, and Claire's car was in the driveway, and the window was open and there was crying. I thought it was just women and children." She stopped. The pause was a place where a truth might be nested. Her face had sought permission to go further. "You thought what?" James asked, with the gentleness of someone who knew the sound of fear. That there was explanation. That perhaps it was nothing, she said. She sipped her tea. I didn't want to judge. But there was a time when Claire would come home early and she'd have these bruises by her wrist. I thought, poor thing. Then one afternoon I saw the boy on the porch and he was clinging to something tight and not letting go. He looked like he was waiting for someone to come open the door. I thought then, maybe there's more to it. Those small shards of witness pooled into something James could handle. He had to make them more substantial. He began to look for concrete evidence. The boy's drawings multiplied. Dark houses, doors keyed from the inside, closets with thick curtains. One had a staircase leading down and a small blue circle with the child's label, MOM. Most were scribbled away, hidden under couch cushions or folded into the bottoms of coloring books. He began to collect them like field notes. Claire's answers grew thinner. She made invitations for community events and made sure to be photographed with Lucas on the stoop, a domestic trophy for her social media. The pictures were curated. The smiles were even. James kept them aside like a man's map, but the maps did not explain the door that the child insisted kept opening and closing in his imagination. The door labeled in there. He was patient. It was a kind of training to which he had defaulted in most trials of his life. When anger came, he controlled it by the narrowness of his breathing and the steadiness of his hands. He would not storm the house and demand answers. He could see the consequences of such a move. Claire, cornered, could destroy the fragile presence of Lucas's trust. He could not risk a man's show of force against a child's small sense of safety. He would seek confirmation, hard evidence, and then he would remove the child properly and with no careless theatrics. At 22% into his return, something shifted. James had been for several days running a parallel game, watch, gather, shield. He had enlisted an ally in the local police detective, Malik Reyes, who had spent 20 years on the beat learning the difference between rumor and evidence. Malik did not rush. He did not promise miracles. He listened to James' present drawings and witness statements and photographs like a man assembling parts of a machine. Where James had been a soldier by trade, Malik was a patient mechanic. He arranged for a welfare check. It could be anything, he warned. A child's imagination is a dangerous storyteller, but it can also be a true witness. We'll look for a pattern. The pattern arrived precisely as a pattern does, by repeating. A neighbor's camera, an old motion-activated lens James had managed to access with the quiet help of Mrs. Fenn, captured a sequence of evenings where Claire would return late and send Lucas swiftly inside. The grainy footage showed shadows crossing the window and the child's small silhouette pressing against the glass for a matter of seconds before being yanked away. It was small and valuable and terrible. Those are 3 different nights, Malik said, hands folded over his shirt. That's not a lot, but it's more than a coincidence. James watched the frames again and again. In one, the child's arms pressed at the window in a way that said less about running and more about keeping someone from leaving. In another, a sound pattern someone's voice refused to decode. The footage made the small word the boy had said into a louder thing. She's in there, James thought, listening to the echo of the phrase as if it could be amplified to reveal its contents. At 30% of the arc, a second twist lodged itself in him like a stubborn grain of sand. He found, tucked into the backboard of Claire's wardrobe, a small box that smelled faintly of floral wash. Inside lay a ring of keys, and among them a key he did not recognize, an old iron key with a heavy bow. The key itself was benign, oddly antique, but the presence of a household key that didn't match any lock he knew made his stomach sink. Why would a single domestically tidy household keep an extra key like this? The answer arrived with the child's next drawing. Lucas drew a doorway with a keyhole and an old key beside it. It was rendered with a peculiar intimacy. The lines were patient as if memory had repeated them. James placed the iron key next to the crayon drawing and felt an enormous loneliness answer back. It was real. The key and the drawing corresponded. Somewhere in the house a door was locked against a child's knowing, and that door might as well have a human behind it. He had to be careful now. A wrong step would mean an accusation without proof, a forcible separation that could bruise a child's heart more than the existence of the danger itself. He continued to watch. Claire grew more defensive in her small acts, more precise in her movements. She began to insist on being present in unusual ways, the way a proud person does when they fear being found false. She insisted on sleeping in the hallway outside Lucas's door one night. She refused James's offer to sit up with him. James accepted the refusal because bluffing anger was not his method. He would wait until he had undeniable proof. At 45% of the slow burn, less than halfway through the long unraveling of days, James reached his limit of patience. He had layered evidence. Drawings, a witness camera, the key that matched a child's depiction. He had a neighbor's whispered account. He had watched Claire time her comings and goings. There was a sense in him like a mechanical tension pulling tight. He knew enemies in the world of human cruelty. Not only opportunists and bullies, but those who used small, invisible, violent instruments to reify control. He imagined a woman who perfected the art of erasing discomfort by blaming grief, who turned a child's strange, inner image of a mother into an exile rather than a red flag. He wanted to be sure. He wanted a method that did not rely only on his anger. He wanted to honor his past best, the obligation to prevent harm, and when necessary, to remove an innocent from it. There are moments a man carries like a ledger in war and in love. Orders, mistakes, pardons sought and not given. James's past carried the weight of one such item that had defined him for years. The image of a convoy road he had let pass on a day when he could have acted differently. That memory had formed a vow, precise and brittle, that he would never again ignore a small voice shouting in the dark. Lucas's whisper was a small voice. He could not ignore it. The first reveal, at exactly the schedule we had all sensed, arrived in a way that was neither dramatic nor clean. One evening Claire left the house ostensibly to visit a friend and took too long to return. The light over the porch remained unlit, then blinked on, then off. James lay in wait in his car down the street the way a man hides his hope. He watched Claire's car arrive and then saw her move with a speed that belied practiced duty. She came in, gathered a bag, and left again. She locked the front door behind her. James's pulse raced, not with rage but with a controlled necessity. He followed, down a lane, across 2 blocks, into a part of town where streetlights kept a wary distance from the houses. Claire's movements seemed rehearsed. She parked, ascended steps. From a distance James watched as she turned a key in a rusted old gate and let herself in behind a narrow, anonymous house that did not belong to the civic picture she'd been painting at home. James pulled his vehicle aside and called Malik. "I'm outside a house 12 blocks from her place." "She came in," he said. "Stay there," Malik replied. "Don't interfere. I'll meet you there. We need a warrant if something's inside we have to open." James had to wait across a quiet field, his breath creating fog in the cold night. He had time to stare at his hands and remember things. Anna laughing at a burnt breakfast, Lucas's first word cut oddly through a long night, memories that meddled with the machinery of action. Malik arrived with the slow, professional gait of someone who had seen too much hurry and not enough consequence. They approached the house together, the metal key James had found in his pocket a phantom weight at his heart. Malik knocked and a woman answered. Thin, pale, the light behind her turning her into a silhouette of normality. Claire's car was there. The woman looked at their faces and then at the pair on the step. Her house smelled like old air and something used to cover sorrow. They asked to check. The woman blinked, then consented. The interior of the house was narrow and smelled faintly of solvent. A small corridor led to a room at the back. Malik moved with an economy of motion. James followed, and when he reached the door he felt the particular intensity of a man about to witness a private treachery. Inside, the room was set up not as a child's room but as a small shrine to avoidance. A mattress on the floor sat beneath a barricade of folded sheets and a small stack of children's blankets. A table held a few toys, arranged with a kind of precise order that disguised urgency. The more telling thing was the door. A heavy, bolted door at the back, its lock not the sort you kept to keep a neighbor out but one you used to keep a person in. The bolt was small, iron and cheap, but it was set with the kind of intent that mattered. James's hand wanted to reach for it, to fling it open, But there was a procedure. Malik called for backup and a locksmith. Waiting. It was the worst part. The in-between of a man who had seen how timing can ruin rescue and the procedural reality that kept the law functional rather than vengeful. The locksmith's arrival was a small fight with nails and pins and the patient work of unlocking. When the bolt finally yielded and the door swung open, the air that issued out had the same quality as old dust. Stale and clotted. A small shape lay curled on the mattress. It did not look like the drawings, but its smallness and the curl were familiar. It lifted its head like a ghost of expectation. Lucas lay there. His face was ghostly in the dim light, the purple under his eyes deep enough that James felt as if the child's expression had been stolen. He wore an oversized t-shirt and clutched the same threadbare dinosaur. When he saw James, his first motion was barely an instinct, a question asked in the quiet of a sleeper. Then, with a motion that belonged to none of them, the man in uniform who remembered every day's failure and the detective who had seen too many nights undone, the child looked away. He did not yet move to flirt with rescue. He had been taught to shelter his own small astonishment. The room smelled like old sweat and the kind of fear made material. Sealed air, little crumbs of missed meals. There were pads and sponges and something else that suggested Claire had been organized about the child's needs and about the child's isolation. The bolt had been used not as a household precaution but as a tool of a controlling interior. It was never an accident to keep a child in a room from which the world could not enter. James held himself together by attention. He guided the child outside, not touching him in a way that might have broken the delicate, brittle trust that had taken hold in those dark hours. He let Malik speak in the law's tones and let the women's neighbors come forward with their whispered, shame-shaped testimonies. Claire stood on the porch looking at them all like an actress seeing the audience she had never wholly known and losing her script. The first reveal had been the key and drawing, but the door being opened and the bolt yielding was the thing that confirmed all small accounts into a charged, visible fact. The boy's insistence had matched his reality. The second twist, at the pre-planned point of 50%, arrived as testimony that made the scene less private. The elderly woman in the house across the street, whose camera had taken the frames, now had a voice that was steadier than her hands. "It wasn't always like this," she said in court voice, answering to the small cluster of reporters and the steady professional cameras that now recorded details like a slow, inevitable storm. Claire was reserved but respectable. "It wasn't until she started taking control of the boy that I felt." She stopped, and the space she left had the room for meaning to enter. Claire's story, inevitably, was both simpler and more calculated than one might want. She had been close to James's family, an aunt by choice, a friend by convenience. When Anna had been sick, she had been helpful in small ways, knitting and watching, bringing casseroles and comforting presents. But when Anna had died and James had been away on active duty, Claire had found a niche. She had become more than helpful. She became a steward of the household's social face. She began to perform all the tasks the dead woman had performed and then some. It is a dangerous step to cross when grief and hubris marry. You substitute your own idea of what is right for the reality of a child's needs. The third reveal, scheduled for 70%, came in an interrogation transcript that the local paper later published in redacted form. Under careful questioning, a neighbor admitted she'd spotted a bag of certain items in Claire's trunk, sponges and gloves, and a particular gel that a child might find more punishment than cleaning. Claire had told stories of Lucas being too loud, of him acting savage with energy. She had said that structure must be enforced. She'd done it with the gentle cruelty of a person who believes she is forming someone into a social instrument. James listened to the transcripts the way a man listens for the cadence of a lie. There was always a point at which such people slipped, where their grand rhetoric about structure and love fell into the human need to be perfect. Claire's slip had been a moment of passion, she had said, in a private recorded phone call that Malik had managed to trace. "I can't have him ruining everything for me. My life is at stake. He looks like her. He always looks like her, and it's like living with a ghost." That phrase, "living with a ghost," was the last piece that explained the contours of her envy and the cruelty's psychological root. Her motives, when exposed, carried the hallmarks laid out in the script: selfish gain, social status, the comfort of being the household's perfect steward, maintaining a facade, projection of past trauma, and an undercurrent of pathological jealousy toward Anna's lingering presence in the boy. But motives are ways to understand the story, not to repair the damage. In court, motives can tell juries why something happened. They cannot return what was stolen. James, for his part, felt a change within him like the great unlocking of his emotional armor. He had been a man whose past failure had been a weight he carried, not a rock but a compass that inclines toward action. His transformation had begun slowly, from detached soldier to a returning father who refused to ignore his child's small cry. He had intended to be a protector. He now had to be the child's entire armor. The child, however, delivered his own small revolution. Throughout the slow revelation, Lucas did not speak much. He left evidence. Drawings, a key, the press of his small body at the window at night. He had whispered the line that started everything. The child's speech was never expository. It was a code. It had to be interpreted emotionally, carefully. His gestures were the language of those who had been taught to be small. It took months of legal negotiations before the authorities could secure a formal custody arrangement. Courts move at a procedural pace, meant to buffer against rushes that could destroy lives. During that time, James operated as a patient siege. He gathered records. He ensured Lucas received small acts of normalcy, lunches with other children, a ribbon for homemade craft. He made a life for himself in a borrowed unit, painting pale yellow on the walls of a small room because he believed color steadied the nervous system. He worked with a child psychologist, Dr. Lillian Ward, who had the patient clarity of someone trained not to be swayed by the spectacular. Dr. Ward's approach was slow and granular. She asked James to be consistent and to understand that healing was not a straight line. "What you provide," she told him in a voice as thorough as a surgeon's, "is a context for safety, not a single rescue. Your son will need experiments in trust. He will need you to be both fortress and gentle gardener." There were moments of sublime smallness. The boy began to sleep more in the open, to let James read him stories without counting the sentences. He started to make small noises of speech that filled rooms. A laugh at a cartoon, a muttered observation about the sky. But there were also relapses, night terrors, a compulsion to hoard crackers, to place them in the corners of drawers as if preparing a small food reserve. He would sometimes resist at the sight of a bedroom door being closed, or freeze when a key jingled. James learned the art of moving slowly, of making entrances calm. He learned to introduce locks as things that could be left unlocked, not used to shut someone away. The social aftermath unraveled as expected. Claire's image slipped in the neighborhood like paint left out in rain. Her friends withdrew politely. She claimed she had acted out of care and tough love, phrases that were met with a kind of public patience. Courts, when they decide guilt, try to temper finality with the language of law. Claire was charged and tried. She insisted she had been overwhelmed, that grief had been the engine of her manner and not malice. She avoided acknowledging the specific acts. The jury's job is to decide. The law's process is ugly in its objectivity. But justice is not only the court's heavy gavel. It can be the small, taut mercy of a child's return to his father. The case culminated in a public confrontation that broke the facade in a way that drew gasps in the courtroom. Claire, in a moment of breakdown, stood and spoke in a tone of whiplashed righteousness. "I did what I thought was best," she cried. "I couldn't have him be a ruined thing in my home. He needed form. Someone had to enforce the shape." The phrase, "enforce the shape," became for many in the room a monstrous euphemism. And then Lucas did something he had never done in public before. The child, small and breathless, walked forward, swaying like a reed, and held up a drawing he had drawn in secret under the bed. A picture of a door with a key left inside of it and a small figure labeled, behind it. He held the page up like an answer to a question that decades of adult speech struggled to say. His voice was nothing like the booming summons of grown accusation. It was, rather, the whittled, precise sound of a child newly permitted to speak. "She's in there," Lucas said. Not screaming now but steady. She couldn't be outside. She had to be in there all the time. The court fell into a hush. The part that followed was procedural but no less dramatic. The judge's sentence was firm. Claire faced consequences that fit the law's calculus. She was ordered to receive psychological treatment and to be barred from children's care for a determined period. The sentence was as much a social act as a punitive one. She would not be permitted near Lucas again, except under supervised arrangements for therapy and restitution. James, the man who had once felt the hollow of a failure so keen it had become a map, allowed himself a dissolving of the armor he had used for years. In public, he kept a measured face. In the car, afterward, he let a silence fall between him and Lucas where a child's breath sounded like a small tide. The boy, at last, slept without the darting watchfulness of a small animal. He began to rebuild a palette of ordinary pleasures. Cereal poured with no fear of ration. Saturdays of cartoons and scrambled eggs. The simple, unremarkable joy of being allowed to spill a box of cereal and not be scolded into tidiness. The time of healing demanded a new set of skills. James learned to be a father in ways he had never been forced to be before. To make pancakes, to buy school supplies in colors Lucas preferred rather than those James assumed, to navigate parent-teacher conferences with a softness that had nothing to do with the soldier's professional tone. He learned to answer the boy's small, cryptic speech with patience rather than interpretation. When Lucas whispered a line, a name or a phrase, James did not flinch into interrogation. He listened, accepted, and provided silences. He pressed a small, steady presence into the child's days as if he had become a new kind of sentinel, not one of weapons but of patience. Part of their work was ritual. They established a nightly routine of reading by a small lamp and talking about 2 moments per day that were good. It was a therapy technique, Dr. Ward explained, but it was also a reintroduction to the practice of noticing small pleasures. Lucas's first laugh, a hiccuping sound born from a cartoon animal falling into a puddle, was a revelation each time it occurred. It became, for James, an answer for all the nights of cold vigilance. He had made promises to himself in other wars, promises that had been broken. He now made a different kind of oath, to assemble his son's days with patience and to never again leave a door bolted and unquestioned. The community response was complicated. Some neighbors rallied, offering casseroles and trivial gifts. The small kindnesses people used to recalibrate a world that had been taught a disturbing lesson. Others retreated into discreet judgment, as if sorrow were a contagious stain. There were articles written about the case, the headlines fragile and moralistic, about the dangers of outsourced caregiving, and the slippery idea that civility and control are sometimes partners in cruelty. There were cognitive examinations of Claire's motivations. Jealous affection, projection of history, a need to fashion life into an image that excluded messy grief. Those articles could not, of course, fix the child's enacted days, nor the small things a child loses when someone decides their needs are subordinate to the maintenance of a perfect house. As months turned, Lucas's body relearned to be a child's body. He began to climb a small tree in the backyard, the leaves scraping his knees in a way that looked exactly like freedom. He learned to swim without new rituals of fear. He collected stickers on his hand. He made friends. Small offerings like this he accepted the way a patient might accept sunshine after long clouds. He no longer pressed his ear to the locked doors of the house. There were fewer locked doors now, and keys were things he handled under James's guidance. He placed a key on a string and wore it around his neck for a time, a small, symbolic talisman against the past. James's internal transformation was slower and equally, finally, more complete. He had come back with guilt in his bones, the open wound of the time he'd been absent and failed to protect, the memory of Anna's last hospital corridor where his hands had been too full of duty to do other things. He had used the remembered failure as a spur and sometimes as a shield. Grief can serve as both a ladder and a cage. His new life involved confessions and small reparations. He found work with a local contractor who needed a man with steady hands. He learned the difference between the precision of a soldier's plan and the messy, improvisational ways a child's day requires. He learned to slow down, to get lost in the process of making a sandwich and enjoy the child's clumsy conversations. There was a long evening, 6 months in, where he and Lucas went back to the porch where James had first stood, rain-slimed and far away. The world smelled of cut grass. Lucas had taken to carrying his dinosaur everywhere, but he no longer clutched it as if it were a single salvation. He dropped it briefly in a small field and then returned to it as if to test the world. He turned to James and asked, bluntly, "Will you ever leave?" In the way small children ask questions that are the size of a life. "No," James said. "Not like that. Like, not ever coming back." Lucas clarified, his brow pinched in the manner of someone assembling categories. James inhaled. The answer he wanted to say was more complicated. There were deployments still possible in any man's life who had worn uniform, but the promise he could honestly give was partial and square. "I will be here. I won't let you be locked away in any rooms again." Lucas considered this. He drew his thumb across the dinosaur's frayed seam, and then he nodded. It was the small, quiet acceptance that does not require fireworks. For James, it was enough. It was the kind of answer that will not heal all the wounds but can at least stop the new ones from forming. The final cascade of truth, the part where witnesses finally came forward, occurred in a public manner that felt, in a way, inevitable. When Claire was suspended from the community's volunteer programs and later convicted under the statutes that govern child endangerment, other women who had once orbited around her candor revealed small truths. They spoke of the way Claire had arranged playdates to right the situation for her, or of gifts she brought in exchange for silence. Their testimonies were not heroic in tone. They were small, ashamed confessions that they had allowed a facade to exist because their own lives were too precarious to risk a scandal. The community learned, to its cost, about the price of looking away. The public reckoning did not, however, turn everyone into pariahs or saints. The society that allowed the setting for the abuse was not broken by a single conviction. It held within it the same structural problems, insufficiencies of childcare, societal pressure to keep appearances, reward systems for those who maintain a certain kind of order that had made Claire's actions possible. The trial sat like a storm cloud over local politics for a while, and then it dampened into small, incremental changes. Better oversight for childcare arrangements, a free counseling fund for families, community education about recognizing signs of abuse. These remedies were not complete, but they were something. The epilogue of this story does not require fireworks. It develops like a garden in which small plants grow. 8 months after the door had been opened and the bolt revealed and the courtroom had done its work, James and Lucas sat on a new couch in a modest living room painted a forgiving dove gray. There were toys on the floor in their authentic state, unnumbered, unrehearsed, messy. Lucas had left a trail of stickers across the coffee table. He had drawn, in temporary bursts, a house without a locked door and a sun that took up the top corner of the page without fear. They walked to the park on a Saturday morning and let the child climb the same small tree as before. A neighbor waved. Mrs. Fenn hugged them both and gave Lucas a small knitted hat she'd made. James felt gratitude the way a man might feel heat. It warmed and softened him. He gave the woman his thanks in a natural way that no longer needed the armor. It was a small social rebirth. One late night, as Lucas slept with the dinosaur at his side and the lamp's light cast soft halos on the wall, James sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. He traced the child's drawings again, keeping them like an inventory of the past. He thought of Anna's laugh and of the promise he'd made to himself that he would never be a man who let warning signs go unanswered. He had paid a high emotional toll for the price of vigilance. He had earned, in his mind, a fragile, exhausted mercy. The final scene in this chronicle of long, slow rebuilding was domestic and quiet. They ate pancakes with too much syrup and Lucas spilled some and then giggled about it. James pretended to be stern and then collapsed into laughter. The domestic scene was not an eradication of memory, but it was evidence of something true, that a child could begin, again and again, to trust. Lucas would have nights where he would wake and call his father's name, but those nights grew fewer and less tethered to a jerk of anxious fear. He began, in small, splendid ways, to become a child again. A year after the bolt was turned and the iron key left in a drawer, Claire sat in a facility where she was required to attend therapy and reflect on the ways she turned her need for control into a method of coercion. Whether she would ever truly change is a question that lives in the brittle domain of all public wrongdoing. Some elements of her rehabilitation were visible. She attended therapy sessions, wrote apologies that read like drafts of atonement. But we must allow one truth to stand. The internal possibility for redemption remained ambiguous. It is rare for cycles of control to unspool entirely by order of law. Some things need a life of reflection, community enforcement, and the slow unpicking of belief systems that make violence into a metric of mastery. The community's gentleness was not the same as breadth. People did not forget the entire incident. Some forgot a lot. Some learned. The legal consequences were certain enough. The court had handed Claire a sentence that removed her from the house and required reparatory measures. The child's safety had been secured, and James had become his legal guardian with papers that gave him formal duty and the right to take vacations without fear. On a warm spring afternoon, Lucas pressed a finger to a new drawing pinned on the wall. This one was a messy landscape of a park and a man by a tree and a house with its door wide open. He had drawn a sun so big it leaked onto the paper, a giant presence that had room in the top corner and made everything else small by comparison. James looked at it and felt the large, slow, satisfying release people sometimes call contentment. The boy had made a drawing that did what drawings should do. It told the truth about a present safe enough to be joyful. A narrator could ask, what about the larger forces that made Claire's actions possible? Those are questions that weigh on communities long after court reporters pack up their cameras. What about the social pressures that favor appearances over messy grief? What about the cultural assumption that when someone volunteers to help in a family, their actions need no oversight? Those are not questions this story solves. They are, rather, questions it poses. They are invitations for audiences to reflect. What structures do we tolerate that allow a person to isolate and control a child's life? What actions are we willing to take when the tidy facade is clearly the costume of cruelty? Now, dear reader, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever noticed a child's small, strange behavior and felt the prick of worry that you didn't voice? What did you do? Did the small calling of a my moms in there ring true to you as it did to James? Have you known people like Claire, wounded, controlling, capable of mistaking dominance for care, or had to confront someone you loved about behavior you could not ignore? These are not easy questions, but perhaps your answers can help me understand where this story reaches into the world you inhabit. Share a memory or a quiet thought, a small testimony. The community of those who have been vigilant is not large, but it is real, and your sharing might make a signal stronger in someone else's life. If you keep something in your comments, if you leave a small story of when you saw someone acting like a guard of order or when you noticed an odd hush around a child, maybe it will teach someone else to listen earlier. How do we begin to change the social circuits that permit quiet abuse? Does human decency come in the form of intervention, in the speech we use to break silence, or in small acts of neighborly curiosity? I invite you to hold this story against the life you know and to ask, what would you do? Would you follow the same slow path James did, patient, gathering evidence, involving the law, or would you choose a more immediate confrontation? What do you think the right balance is between immediate rescue and careful, lawful intervention? Tell me where you stand. There is a final, private scene I will leave you with. One night, after bedtime stories and after Lucas had been tucked in with his dinosaur, James sat in the doorway of his son's room and watched him breathe. The lamp cast a small yellow pool of light on the floor. Lucas turned in his sleep and whispered, half awake, an echo of that first night, "Daddy!" He did not cry. When James answered, it was with the odd, steadied voice of a man who had been to war and returned to a new front. "I'm here," he said. Lucas pressed a hand into the dinosaur and turned toward the wall where a new drawing hung. A house unbolted, a big sun, and a small man by the tree. Two figures, tiny and close. In his sleep the child smiled. James watched the slow movement and felt an end to his vigilance that was not permanent, only gentler. He felt a small forgiveness for himself, a letting of the wound into the larger world. If you are here now, reading, perhaps take a moment to look at the people around you. If you see something that does not fit, speak up. We do not have to wait for a soldier to come home to correct all the world's wrongs. Sometimes the only person needed is the one who will listen and act with both rapidity and care. Have you been that person? If not, what is stopping you? If you have, what helped you find the courage? Share in the comments. Your small story may be the key another neighbor needs to open a door. We end with a quiet picture. Lucas running down the path toward a small, battered playground, his dinosaur bobbing like a flag in the clean wind. James follows at a measured pace, hands empty but ready. The sunlight rests on them both. The day is ordinary. The life they weave will be ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. This is the long road home. Not an arrival but a patient, sustained presence. The doors remain unlocked now, for the most part. But if ever a bolt appears again, James will be there to check it out, keys in hand, heart steady, tired but unyielding.